The long-awaited sequel Alan Wake 2 is finally here, and I've spent the last couple of days testing 32 GPUs in a variety of graphics presets at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. So strap in, because this is going to be a long one. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits from my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th Gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32GB of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. Okay, so before we jump into the numbers, it's worth taking a look at the game and the graphical presets, as well as putting a small caveat on this whole thing. If you're rocking an older, or let's say budget GPU, then I'll tell you right now, this is not the game for you. Remedy, who make the game, along with other top titles like Max Payne and Control, have gone pretty nuts, and this really is the most intensive game you can play right now. Now, when Control came out, it was regarded as a graphical masterpiece, which highlighted the likes of ray tracing to levels we'd never seen before. And to one-up that, Alan Wake 2 takes it even further, with ray reconstruction and path tracing at the forefront of it all. And to put it into perspective as to how intensive the game is, there's no way of turning upscaling completely off. No TAA, no MSAA, just FSR and DLSS, though you can set the upscale resolution to the same, so I guess you could argue that it's native, though it's not in the same sense as a native resolution with temporal anti-aliasing would actually be. Now, in terms of the settings, it's a nightmare. FSR, DLSS, low, medium, high, which even then doesn't set some settings to high. Then you have to decide if you want the post-processing quality set to low or high, along with shadow detail too, as these don't change as the kind of, change in the quality preset does. Then once you've decided all of that, do you turn ray tracing on or off? As, well, spoiler alert, it actually looks amazing without the kind of huge tank in performance. Then, if you do enable ray tracing, do you turn on ray reconstruction if you have any form of RTX card? And do you go ahead with path tracing? And then to what level? Though both of these are set by the ray tracing preset at least. Now, what I'm trying to get at is that we spent a good long time trying to figure out what settings beyond standard rasterization we should use for our testing. And with 32 GPUs at 3 different resolutions, I knew that we had our work cut out for us. So hopefully we've done the game justice and have done enough testing for you guys and girls to see. And if we didn't test something, then tough, because after many 17-hour days of solid benchmarking, I think I'm actually done with the game for now, until I actually get time to play it and not be testing it. Now, in terms of quality, I'm more of a figures guy, but I will talk about how things look very quickly, which even on low, you're not going to be disappointed. The game looks amazing, lighting looks realistic, shadows are as you'd expect, and textures and reflections seem true to life. Bumping up through to medium seems to add more rubbish to the scene that we tested on, which was quite funny as we kind of flicked through between low and medium, though lighting did seem to get much improved, along with textures and detail just feeling a lot better overall. Then when moving up to high, I wouldn't say that there was a kind of as big of a jump, but the already stunning looking visuals just seemed to get a bit more refined, and the lighting and shadows just seemed, I guess, a bit smoother overall. Obviously, in terms of lighting and shadows, that's where ray tracing improves on things, but maybe not in the way that you'd expect. The reflections and lighting are already great, but ray tracing along with its many settings just seem to make it, more realistic. Instead of a light behind you casting a kind of flickering light off the wall, it turns it into more of a realistic glow that ramps up and down, which, as ray tracing is meant to, just makes the whole scene more, true to life. Though, if you had it disabled to obviously improve your frame rate performance, you're not going to be sad or feel like you're missing out, as Remedy have really gone to town on textures, reflections, and just general rasterization quality. And that's why you'll see that even in our non-ray traced performance, a lot of cards actually struggled quite dramatically. Now before we get into the figures, I want to put a disclaimer on that while we did attempt lots of settings, some GPUs just couldn't handle what was being thrown at them at the higher settings or higher resolution scenarios. We also found that certain GPUs, though they did run, they suffered quite dramatically in terms of just losing all texture mapping where the lower VRAM count just essentially fell over. Also, Intel. My good friends, Intel. Even though they should have been fine and some cards come with 8GB of VRAM, even on the latest Arc driver, which adds support for Alan Wake 2, found an error popping up about lack of VRAM and ran, well, pretty much like a potato. So we decided to not even follow up and haven't included them in our testing. Now what we have included is 32 GPUs from AMD and Nvidia. So we've essentially tested all 30 and 40 series RTX cards, as well as all AMD 6000 and 7000 series cards as well. Now, to benchmark, we built a new GPU test system specifically for this, consisting of an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB DDR5 6000 MHz CL30 memory. For our motherboard, these parts were installed on the Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with the latest BIOS version, and all of our testing was done on the latest update of Windows 11 with the latest AMD 23.10.2 and Nvidia 545.92 drivers. Also, as mentioned, we ran quite a lot of our tests across these GPUs, so if you want to get access to the charts and want to show your support for the huge amount of work we put into testing, then you can over on our Patreon. The link is, as always, down below. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting things off with FSR2 set to native and at 1080p on the low setting, where things are looking pretty good across the board, albeit at low settings. The Nvidia RTX 4090 tops the chart, which was expected, while AMD's top tier RX 7900 XTX sits just under 7% slower, though we are somewhat CPU limited here, even with the 7800 X3D. As we move further down the chart, the likes of the latest RX 7800 XT sits at a comfortable 135 FPS, with last generation's RTX 3080 12GB almost matching it in performance, separated by just a single frame. Moving further down again, even the likes of the RTX 4060 sits in the mix at 74 FPS, which puts it just ahead of AMD's RX 7600. While older generation AMD and Nvidia cards like the RTX 3050 and RX 6500 XT do sit below 60 FPS but are still playable at over 30 FPS, though through my own experience it can lead to some form of motion sickness at the lower frame rate if playing for too long. As we move up to 1440p, the RTX 4090 stretches its legs even more at the top of the stack, commanding an astonishing 24% lead over the flagship RDNA 3 based GPU, which still comes in with a strong 123 FPS, though at the low setting, while the game still looks great, gives you a sign of things to come. Last gen's 3080s are still holding strong and matching the performance of the RX 7800 XT, while the RX 6950 XT sits just behind that at 83 FPS. Then, as we move down the stack, even the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB now falls just below 60 FPS, which isn't great in the grand scheme of things, with 13 GPUs in total now sitting below 60, and the RTX 3050 and 6500 XT both falling below a somewhat playable 30 FPS, with the 6500 XT having some real shortcomings due to that 4GB of VRAM at just 12 frames per second. As we move up to 4K, a lot of GPUs taper off below 60 FPS, with only the RTX 4080, 7900 XTX and RTX 4090 being the only cards that manage 60 plus FPS, again with the 4090 leading by an impressive 33%. Though I say impressive, again, we're still only on the low preset. Other cards that are below 60 FPS are still more than playable at above 30, but a lot of cards from last gen, along with the RTX 4060, 4060 Ti and RX 7600, now all present an experience that just isn't any fun at sub 22 FPS, and with the laughable 6500 XT now coming in at just 2 FPS on average. At 1080p on the medium preset, we are still CPU limited at the lower resolution, and while performance does drop for some cards, the order remains somewhat unchanged. The RTX 4090 still leads the way over the 7900 XTX, while performance is strong across the board when looking at mid to top tier cards from Nvidia and AMD's last generation. If wanting to play at 1080p on medium settings, you'll ideally be wanting an RTX 4060, RX 7600 or something higher, even from last generation to kind of really push those playable frame rates, though the likes of the RX 6700 and RTX 3060 are still holding up at 59 and 58 FPS respectively. As we move further down, the RTX 3050 comes in at 42 FPS, which is playable, though the dips may present themselves in the more intensive parts of the game, while the RX 6500 XT has now seemingly died with a did not finish, or a did not start for that matter. Moving up to 1440p on medium and everything just shifts down a bit. We still have strong performance from both the 7900 XTX and RTX 4090, though the RTX 4080 only sits just behind the AMD flagship by just 4%. Again, everything from AMD's 7700 XT and up still gives strong numbers at just over 60 FPS, along with Nvidia's 3070 Ti or higher spec, again hitting that 60 FPS marker or above. A lot more cards now fall below that, but above 30, so will still give a gameplay experience that can still be enjoyed, though the RX 6600 now falls just below and into the realms of unplayable gameplay, along with the RTX 3050. As we move up to 4K on the medium preset, only 2 cards now manage to hit 60 FPS or above, that being the RX 7900 XTX and RTX 4090 at 60 and 80 FPS respectively, though at 58 FPS the RTX 4080 is still a strong contender. Some of the older but higher end 30 series cards still manage to do the business at 40 FPS or higher, and in terms of still remaining playable, the 7700 XT manages to cling on at 31 FPS, as well as the RTX 4070 sitting at 36 FPS. Though again, those small dips could make a world of difference in terms of having a fluid gameplay experience, where now half of the GPUs tested are now, well, unplayable at this combination of this resolution and on this graphical preset. Moving back around to 1080p, but now on the high preset, and there's still a lot of cards presenting some pretty strong numbers. Again, the RTX 4090 leads the way with a 15% margin over the 7900 XTX, and some noticeable mentions again by the way of the RTX 3080 10 and 12GB cards, and the RX 6950 and 6900 XT from AMD, with them all coming in over 100 FPS. Now as we move down, the 7700 XT still holds up strong at 91 FPS, and everything from the RX 7600 and above hitting that 60 FPS threshold that most gamers crave. Though the RTX 4060 falls just short, it's within margin of error, and everything other than the RX 6500 XT is still playable to a degree, including the lackluster RTX 3050 from Nvidia. Things still look pretty good at 1440p on the high preset, where the 4090 still shows the rest of the stack how it's done, and the performance of the 7900 XTX and RTX 4080 draw ever closer. There's still a lot of cards above 60 FPS, including the 3080 range again, and the 7800 XT from AMD, while the likes of the 6800 XT and 7700 XT just fall a margin of error difference short at 58 FPS each. There's now half of the cards tested at below 60 FPS, though the majority still sit above 30, which is still arguably playable, just not as enjoyable in the more intensive scenes. Though the RX 6600 XT, 6600 and RTX 3050 are all coming in below 30, and with lows it will certainly be noticeable. Then at 4K we find only one card coming in above 60, which is of course the RTX 4090. And now we see performance on the RTX 4080 and 7900 XT matching identically in both the averages and the 1% lows. And though they come in at 52 FPS, still going to lead to a good, solid gameplay experience. Many of the other cards still surpass 30 FPS, though now the likes of the RX 6900 XT sits just on that marker, and the newer 7700 XT drops down to just 28 frames per second, while 15 GPUs are what I'd class as, I guess, completely unplayable at 24 FPS or below, and now with some instances of single digit figures in the 1% lows, and in-game really noticing some real anomalies, including textures and bump mapping just, well, simply disappearing. Now, as we've tested all GPUs using FSR2 in the native mode, I did want to show on the Nvidia cards the key difference between FSR and DLAA in terms of performance. And as expected, DLAA comes in the better performing in comparison to FSR on every GPU, where at 1080p we see mainly small gains like 3% more performance on the RTX 4090, a single FPS change on the likes of the RTX 4070 Ti, and similar 3% differences on the RTX 3080 10GB for example. As the performance drops and we look at the 4060 Ti, we do also notice a weird drop in the 1% low when using FSR, where retesting garnered the same result. And then as we further drop down, the RTX 3060 at 52 FPS with FSR and 55 FPS with DLAA shows a stronger 6% margin in favour to Nvidia. Moving up in resolution, it's a very similar story. Nvidia come out on top in both the averages and in some cases the 1% lows, with strong uplifts in performance across the board. Obviously at the higher frame rates like we see on the RTX 4090, again the margins are around 3%, whereas on the lower ends such as the RTX 4060, that margin is much larger at 9% in favour to Team Green's upscaling technology. So if using Nvidia, it seems a bit of a no-brainer between FSR and DLAA. Lastly, looking at comparisons at the higher 4K resolution, again we see 3% extra performance by using DLAA over FSR on the RTX 4090, though most of the performance results as we move down were pretty evenly matched, with a few exceptions like the RTX 3080 10GB, which gains an extra 6% more performance by using DLAA. Though in a couple of instances like the RTX 3070 and 4060 Ti, FSR actually managed to come out on top by margins of around 5%. Though that does only equate to a single FPS. So what about ray tracing? Well, that's where we looked at the various options and settled on the medium preset with medium ray tracing turned on for the best balance of visuals without all of our GPUs simply falling over. And even though that was arguably too much. Now from the data, you can see that really you're looking at an RTX 3080 Ti, 3090 Ti or any 40 series from the 4070 Ti or upwards to reach at least 60 frames per second. While most other cards are or were aimed at 1440p or above gaming, now sit below 30 and 60 FPS, which is playable, don't get me wrong, but we're at medium, at 1080p. Beyond that though, we now have half of the GPUs tested falling below 30 FPS, and now with 4 cards that didn't even finish. Pretty bad for 1080p on medium, I'd say. Moving up to 1440p, and we now only have one GPU out of 32 that comes in over 60 FPS, that being the RTX 4090 at 71 frames per second. Even the likes of the RTX 4080 only managed a pretty sad 51 FPS at 1440p, and we only have 10 GPUs that sit above 30, with the likes of the 7800 XT and 6950 XT both falling into the realms of 20 frames per second. Beyond that, it really does get even worse, now with 5 cards not even able to run it at all, and another 7 that painfully gave us single-digit performance, including the RTX 4060 and 4060 Ti, showing that upscaling is going to be the only saving grace for those cards. There really isn't much to say about 4K on medium with ray tracing set to medium, other than unless you're using an RTX 4090 and don't fancy upscaling, then simply don't bother, as at 37 FPS, it's only just on the brink of being playable, while every other GPU just falls well below that, with now over half of the 32 cards tested coming back in with single digit performance, or simply just not running, or in some cases losing textures and detail and me just giving up completely on even trying to get any kind of result. So there is light at the end of the tunnel if you're on Nvidia, at least due to DLSS 3 or frame generation. Where at 1080p we are still limited by our CPU, even with a 7800X3D, though we do see a performance hit when enabling ray tracing, as we see on the RTX 4090, which started off at 194 FPS native and dropped by a staggering 45% when enabling ray tracing. Though turning Frame Gen on sees that performance jump back up by 81%, from 106 FPS to now 192, and with much stronger 1% low figures than what was presented at native with no ray tracing on. Other cards of note include the RTX 4070, which started at 108 FPS native and dropped to just 52 FPS, which is a drop of 52%. Again, enabling Frame Gen sees a huge increase in performance of 100%, doubling the FPS from 52 to 104, making things completely in the realms of a great gaming experience. Which the same can now be said for the RTX 4060, which dropped to just 8 FPS, and then with Frame Gen now sits at 61. Now as we move up to 1440p, the CPU bottleneck loosens its grip, and again we see some very strong performance uplifts when enabling DLSS 3.0. With the standout cards being the RTX 4090, which initially lost 50% of its performance from native, to then gaining an extra 91% more performance from 71 to 136 FPS. Another standout card is again the RTX 4060 at just 5 FPS with ray tracing enabled, to now sitting at 35 FPS, which isn't great but is playable and is a somewhat laughable 600% increase in performance. Not laughable in a bad way, but just quite funny to see. Then at 4K, the only GPU that can handle Alan Wake 2 on the medium preset with medium ray tracing and with Frame Gen enabled is the RTX 4090 at 75 frames per second, especially after ray tracing tanked the performance by 54% from 80 FPS to just 37. The lower end 4060 series cards really don't stand a chance even with Frame Gen enabled, though the RTX 4070 Ti or above is still playable, though I'd much rather dial down the settings and keep the higher resolution, while also clawing back some extra performance instead of watching my system fall over at its knees. Now, speaking of falling over at its knees, I thought it'd be fun to see what kind of performance we could get on both AMD and Nvidia's respective top tier GPUs of the latest series, with the settings in-game completely maxed out. It's here where the RX 7900 XT is a pretty simple one to talk about. With the preset set to high and ray tracing maxed out too, we managed a pretty poor 15 FPS, while Nvidia came in at 31 under FSR set to native. Enabling DLAA again saw a small increase in performance, though in this instance it does only equate to an extra frame. While Frame Gen, that's kind of where the money is, and it manages to increase that performance, now coming in 118% faster than without Frame Gen at 70 FPS. Meaning that our conclusion really should be that if you want to play Alan Wake 2 on max settings, buy a 4090. So where do I even start? I can't blame the game and say that it's badly optimized or anything, because it's not. And in all honesty, the game does look great, even without ray tracing, and playing it is an extremely enjoyable experience. But then on the flip side, I have RTX 4090s at my disposal to do those tests, and not everyone has thousands to just drop onto a GPU like that. Yes, Frame Gen really ends up being the saving grace for this game, and I can honestly say that Remedy have really modelled this whole title on, let's say, next-gen GPUs that haven't even been announced. It's the only way that you're going to be able to play it without sacrificing something. Whether that be having ray tracing disabled, which still looks amazing, or having upscaling turned on, which I get not everyone is sold on yet. What is clear to see is that AMD suffer, and pretty hard in some cases, and until their frame generation technology takes off and has the ability to be used in titles like this, then I guess Nvidia have the upper hand, and they can use that as a great marketing tool to kind of use when selling their latest RTX lineup of GPUs. Now, I'm torn, and I'm sure a lot of people will be, as to how they look at this game and I guess the overall performance. Are Remedy lazy in the sense that you have to enable upscaling if you want the very best visuals and the features? Yeah, well, and no. I get that they're making this game for the future, and it's almost like the hardware devs are now falling behind, and we actually need next-gen GPUs with newer architecture to really push the performance. But then at the same time, gamers would complain if this game, I don't know, ran too well, and you didn't need a higher tier GPU to push those frames. So I do feel for the devs, but I also feel for the gamers, because, well, there's no way to please them all. Either way, on low, on high, with ray tracing or without, Alan Wake 2 is visually the best game on the planet right now. While your graphics card will take a hammering and a beating, there are ways around it without sacrificing in terms of visuals and still getting an uplift in performance. But right now, you have to have an Nvidia GPU to really appreciate it to its fullest. Sorry AMD, and also Intel, sort your stuff out too, because I would have loved to have featured you here, but that just clearly wasn't happening. For now, that's about going to do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and hopefully you enjoyed the amount of GPUs we featured and the amount of scenarios that we tested. If you did, then a like and a sub to the channel would be appreciated. And if you love what we do and want to show that love for the amount of time that we put into this, then you can support us over on Patreon, where you get access to a whole host of goodies, including exclusive behind the scenes content, access to all of our charts to go through, a super special area in our Discord, which is also linked below, and a great place to hang out, play games and talk tech, plus much, much more. The link for Patreon is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.